Trans-Sumatran Highway is a $1.1 billion project spanning 2,700 kilometers or 1,680 miles from Banda Aceh in the north to Bandar Lampung in the south, and has been a top government priority since 2011. 40% of the land needed for the highway has yet to be acquired, and this highway is slated to run right through key biodiverse forests, Kerinci Seblat National Park, Batang Toru Forest, and the Loser ecosystem. Recently, a tiger was spotted on a construction site in the Riau province along the Pekanbaru-Dumai Highway, sparking wildlife experts to call for protection of the species, and have some experts, such as Bill Lawrence, describing these road projects as opening up a Pandora's box. My name is Mike DiGirolamo, your host for Mongabay Explores, a special podcast series from Mongabay.com's global team, where I speak with experts from the field working to protect the critically threatened forests and animals of Sumatra. Join me bi-weekly as I dive into the unique beauty and key issues of this one-of-a-kind landscape and the people working to protect it. This week, I spoke with SINTAS Indonesia Director and Research Fellow at the San Diego Zoo, Hariyo Beebach Wibisono, and Distinguished Professor at James Cook University, Bill Lawrence, who is also the head of ALERT, the Alliance of Leading Environmental Researchers and Thinkers. I spoke with Beebach and Bill about the proposed and currently under construction Trans-Sumatran Highway, and specifically how it would impact the wildlife and forests that it is projected to run through. Bill has described roads as being the most ubiquitous of all infrastructure projects in existence. Both Beebach and Bill covered how and why these roads themselves aren't necessarily the only thing to worry about, but what those roads bring into these already fragmented and endangered habitats. The list goes on, but poaching, illegal plantations, more infrastructure projects, logging, and mining all come from the construction of roads. And with one slated to go straight through the entirety of what is the sixth largest island in the world, conservationists fear this could be the death knell for many a species already on the brink of extinction. Bill and Beebach, however, stressed that if roads are going to be built, it must be done sustainably.
My name is Hariyo Wibisono. My nickname is Beebach. I have been working for the San Diego Zoo Global for Population Sustainability as a research fellow. And I also the director of SINTAS Indonesia Foundation, a new national NGO that I established in 2018.
Beebach took a moment to comment on the sighting of a Sumatran tiger on the Pekanbaru-Dumai Highway, which is a portion of the Trans-Sumatran Highway, this past February, and like other experts, he wasn't surprised by the occurrence.
Pekanbaru is located in Riau province. The deforestation rate has been very extensive in that area, mostly for plantations and as well as oil companies. So conflict between the tiger and the humans in that area is very often, as well as because the area is so open, then the visibility of the tigers is very high. Conflict between the human and tigers is usually often in that area.
Beebach says the Sumatran tiger requires between 100 and 250 kilometers squared for its territory, making it quite easy for a single road to encroach on many dwindling habitats that the tigers are relying on. But most of all, the roads make previously untouchable habitats open for human activity.
Road development leads to fragmentation of wildlife habitat, especially if it goes through prime tiger habitats. We all know that tiger is a landscape wide species in Sumatra, for example. An adult tiger requires 100 up to 250 kilometers square of area. So they require a large space to forage for prey and secure core area for mating, breeding, and raising cubs. So therefore, roads construction may not only fragmenting the forest, but also bisecting the secure core area which are required by the tigers to reproduce and maintain a healthy population. Also, road construction is a catalyst for other anthropogenic threats against the tiger and their habitats for sure. So obviously, road provide access for people to encroach forest habitats that were previously pristine and untouchable. In many cases, as road is developed, other human activities follow, including encroachment for agricultural crops, illegal logging, as well as poaching on tiger and prey. So in addition, in peripheral habitats, road also increase the visibility for both the tiger and the people, which often lead to unavoided human-tiger interaction. So, the best of my knowledge, once a road is developed or proposed, then it will be continued. And by the end of the day, usually the roads will be constructed anyway by the local government.
Bill echoed Beebach's sentiments and elaborated further on the ensuing environmental degradation and the threat posed by this road, which focuses on three key areas impacting not just Sumatran tigers, but also other charismatic species, including the Tapanuli orangutan.
Right now, it's part of a major initiative by the Indonesian government to punch a road almost 3,000 kilometers long, about 2,700 kilometers long, that would essentially slice all the way from the very bottom of Sumatra, which of course is one of the world's largest tropical islands, and go all the way then right up to the top. In addition to sort of weaving its way up to the top of the country, there would also be a couple of major branches off of that road that are cutting into pristine or near pristine areas of ecosystems. For those reasons, and because the highway would be very close to a number of environmentally extremely critical areas, there's a lot of concern now about this highway scheme and what it might mean. There, as you mentioned, Mike, there are three sort of really critical, hugely important ecosystems in Sumatra. There's more than that, but there's three really magnificent ones. Up in the north, you've got the Lusur ecosystem, which is the last place on Earth where tigers and rhinos and elephants and orangutans still survive together. That's one of the last remnants, in fact, very last remnants of the megafauna that used to dominate tropical Asia and has now very largely been wiped out. So you've got the Lusur ecosystem, and then you go down a little ways, a little further south, and you get this incredible Batang Toru ecosystem, which sustains a unique species of orangutan, the so-called Tapanuli orangutan, which was only discovered quite recently, last few years. It's one of the rarest animals on the planet, endangered animals, and it's a completely new species of great ape, very different from other types of orangutans in terms of its biology and its physiology and behavior and its morphology. This ape only occurs in an area about a tenth the size of Sydney, Australia. It's about 1,200 square kilometers. It's just a tiny little area that it still persists in, and there's probably only about 800 of these apes still living. And then you go further south and to the southwest, and you run into Kerinci Seblat. The thing about Sumatra is so much of the lowlands of Sumatra have been devastated and fragmented and devastated and degraded. And some of the most pristine forests are still surviving in small restricted areas of steep mountainous terrain. And that's really classically what's happening with Kerinci Seblat, is it's in that mountainous terrain along the western side of the country, and so far has been somewhat reserved from large-scale devastation because of its isolation and the topography, but that is looking increasingly likely to change. So the Indonesian government does have ambitious plans for development, and in the debates, it's difficult to identify any nation on Earth that would have, more endangered species per hectare on average than Indonesia. And so it really is an area where some of the most important battles between conservation and environment on the one hand and economic development on the other are going on the planet.
In addition to being the smallest species of tiger, Beebach says the IUCN projects that no more than 600 Sumatran tigers remain, though their population is declining at a sharp rate.
Sumatran tigers is a subspecies of tiger native to Indonesian island of Sumatra. It's the smallest of the tigers, possibly because it evolved on an isolated island habitat of Sumatra and lives in a tropical forest along the equator. You know that wildlife living in humid tropical forests tend to have a small body size compared to those living in temperate zones. The Sumatran tiger's stripes are closer together and its fur is orange but darker than other subspecies, allowing them to blend with the tropical forest habitats. Sumatran tiger have been classified as critically endangered by the IUCN, the World Conservation Union, since 2008. The most recent population viability analysis estimated the population of Sumatran tiger at no more than 600 adult individuals and living in 22 heavily isolated landscapes, with most subpopulations, those living in the smaller area, are fewer than 50 individuals with a declining trend in both population and habitats.
Additionally, between 2000 and 2016, up to 130 of them were killed due to human conflict, which only stands to increase with the construction of the highway.
In a lot of contexts, the roads are sort of the initial death knell for species like tigers, because what you're doing is you're opening up these ecosystems to poachers. And poaching is a really serious problem in countries like China, Vietnam, other places. Tiger parts, tiger bones, tiger teeth, tiger pelts, and other body parts are used in some traditional medicines and other things of which there's essentially no medical evidence, no scientific evidence that these things are actually working. But there is a high price that's paid for tiger parts, and poachers can be very aggressive in moving into these areas. And you tend to see really strong correlations between where the roads are and where the poaching occurs. So this is where you get a lot of snare traps, a lot of hunting activity. The roads are what open up these areas to poaching. So I think that that's really a major concern. The Sumatran tiger its population has plummeted dramatically compared to what it would have been historically. And then in addition, of course, the roads are facilitating, you mentioned the Pandora's box, they're facilitating a lot of forest destruction and fragmentation and degradation. And that also, of course, is impacting tigers as well. So there's really nothing good about the road in terms of tigers or indeed any other large Sumatran wildlife.
I asked Beebach to explain why then this road is being proposed to run through these very fragile ecosystems when the environmental fallout is so severe, and what alternatives there were. He explained that the government chooses this route because they believe going around it would be too expensive.
Conservationists argue that the government should avoid, disturbing the wildlife habitat as far as possible. Like instead of closing the habitat, bisecting the habitat, they can go around the habitat, but they argue that it will be very expensive to build that.
Bill argues that going around, rather than through, is actually the cheaper option, namely due to the fact that the landscape running through Sumatra is hillier, which would hike up maintenance costs, making the project much more expensive in the long run without even counting the impact on the environment.
I absolutely agree with the view that putting roads around ecosystems and protected areas is much, much better than punching holes right through the middle of them or right into the interior of them, which unfortunately is happening in many places in the world. It's interesting to hear the Indonesian government arguing that it's too expensive to move roads around some of these protected areas because in a number of cases, the incidence of road damage and the maintenance costs tend to be much higher in steeper terrain. So you tend to get a lot more in the steeper terrain where you get in these environments, these tropical environments, you get a lot of rainfall. And in steeper environments, there tend to be a lot of areas where water tends to pool and tends to create potholes on roads, and you tend to get slumping in a lot of areas. And there's a requirement for a lot more bridges and overpasses and underpasses, that type of infrastructure. So the bottom line is the construction costs and the maintenance costs for roads in steeper terrain, which is typically where a lot of these protected areas still survive, is a lot more expensive. And it just costs a lot more money to build the roads and to maintain them. And these are really important considerations to take account of. So I think that the government's, how much it's going to cost to put a road around a particular protected area or ecosystem is going to depend on the specifics of the local situation, the local topography, how much additional road is required, how isolated is it? I mean, all these factors are going to come into any kind of comparison. But I would say that in many cases, the construction and the maintenance costs and possibly some other kinds of costs will be lower when you're actually trying to avoid these critical ecosystems than trying to drive roads right through the middle of them.
While 6 wildlife underpasses have been constructed on the highway thus far, many experts warn that these measures aren't really sufficient, particularly when territorial mammals like the Sumatran tiger come into play. Beebach argues that these corridors should be avoided, if possible, and if they're going to be built, they must be built with more local knowledge taken into consideration.
For tiger, for example, it has to be done really carefully because tiger is a territorial animal, you know. So they don't really roam freely except for young adult individuals, which usually roam to find and establish their territories. So building that kind of wildlife corridor has to be the last option, and if it has to be done, it has to be based on a good knowledge on the demography of the local resident tigers, right?
Bill adds that tigers don't really make an effort to avoid roads, but rather the opposite, pointing to the Pekanbaru-Dumai Highway story as an example.
Their fate is pretty intimately tied into forests. And so if forests are going to be disrupted and chopped up and you're going to have hunters running all through them, well, tigers are going to have a very difficult time. I know the story that you're talking about, and it was a spectacular photograph taken of a tiger along the side of a road. And in fact, the area where that was taken is an area known to harbor tigers. When roads go into an area, it's not as though that they avoid the roads. They'll walk along roads and they walk along the sides of roads and all kinds of things. And that's one of the reasons why poachers will go in on a forest road and just put tons of snares in along there, which of course are fatal for tigers and other wildlife. Yeah, what that incident showed is that you do still have tigers, of course, in these key habitats in Sumatra, but as the forests increasingly shrink, of course, the potential for conflicts with people and the potential for disruption of the tigers' populations will hugely increase.
But Bill suggests that we need to rethink land use entirely in planning of these infrastructure projects like roads in a way that doesn't seek to shortcut or infiltrate, but rather harmonizes with nature from the very start. In situations such as this, the concept of sustainability often gets used by experts, corporations, and governments alike. So I asked Bill to define what exactly sustainability means in this context.
What more sustainable development, I wouldn't say sustainable per se, but what more sustainable development in Sumatra would entail in part is trying to move away from the really devastating effects of current land uses on ecosystems. So ecosystems are just being ripped and degraded and destroyed in a very serious way. Well, sustainable development is an interesting concept and phrase, of course, and we talk about it a lot, but truth is, I don't know that humans anywhere are really living in a particularly sustainable way, but it's more a matter of some lifestyles and some approaches are more sustainable than others. But in Sumatra, one of the things that's happening right now, which is so grossly unsustainable, is just the huge amount of devastation and degradation and fragmentation of the native forests. And if you can try to locate infrastructure, such as roads, but also things like hydroelectric dams, power lines, gas lines, other kinds of infrastructure, if you can locate that, position that in the correct places, in the right places, you can actually enhance your economic development, our work suggests, and you can have a lot more sustainable development than if you are not having much planning. So where are you putting that infrastructure? Because that has such a big impact on subsequent development is absolutely crucial. And so much of what's happening right now, the truth is that human societies in many cases simply don't understand very well where infrastructure needs to be located, how it needs to be planned and located and positioned, and how these things can have such a big impact on economic development and societies and on environments. And if we could understand these things better, we could go a long ways towards trying to partially harmonize the huge pressures that we're putting on ecosystems and an environment, along with our need, of course, for economic activity, for food production, for all those things that humans need land for.
Beebach also agrees that in the long run, this is the best option.
Yeah. I mean, for the long run, I think it is the best option, right? Because maintaining the forest intact will provide us with what we call as the ecosystem services for the local peoples, right?
In addition to protecting the environment and a species or many species, protecting these ecosystems also preserves a centerpiece to the Sumatran culture. which the Sumatran tiger occupies.
Yeah, I know that the Sumatran local folk tales prove that their ancestors lived peacefully with wild animals, including the Sumatran tigers. And I know that the connection between the Sumatran culture and the Sumatran tigers can be found from the local folklores and traditions. In Kerinci, Jambi province, for example, there is a myth of Tiger Man, or what we call in Indonesian as manusia harimau. So, and also a tradition called Nangga Harimau, in which the local tribes believe that the spirit of a tiger can be summoned. In several cultures, the local community respect tigers by giving a nickname like Inye, or like grandfather or grandmother in West Sumatran tribes cultures, and Datuk and Ompung, etc. in the other part of the Sumatran islands. For West Sumatran tribes, there is a self-defense practice by the tribes, which they call as silat harimau, the self-defense, or silat harimau in Indonesian language, involving techniques focused on crouching and kicking from a low position, paired with rapid hand attacks, basically mimicking tiger gestures. And traditionally, the Minang respect tigers, as they believe that tigers have souls and help protect the villages from bad matters.
Despite the grim outlook, Beebach says that over the past decade, advocacy for conservation of tigers has increased, and there are efforts by both NGOs and the government to monitor and protect populations of tigers, some of which have been revised and updated to incorporate new information, not just for the Sumatran tiger, but for other iconic species as well.
People awareness about the tiger conservation is quite increasing over the last 10 years, especially the governments. Our government has implemented what we call as smart patrol units who do an intensive adaptive patrols in private tiger landscapes, as well as implementing a robust tiger population monitoring over times, etc. And also there are several national NGOs who keep promoting the tigers as the iconic and the iconic species that should be protected by the people of Indonesia. And the government also produce and publish what they call as the Sumatran Tiger Action Plans that has been renewed recently, that basically emphasize on protecting the tigers both in the large landscape as well as the small landscapes, because the previous strategic plan did not really pay attention on the small landscapes, so that in fact that there are so many tiger-human conflicts happen in that small landscapes. Now the new strategic and action plan mandates us to protect the tiger also in the smaller landscapes. And we also think about the implementation of what we call as a meta-population management, meaning that there should be an effort to manage all those small landscapes which close each other, building kind of either structural or functional corridors, sending tiger individuals in between to increase the genetic variety of those subpopulations. And our government also start thinking about identifying potential tiger and wildlife habitats outside of the protected areas, and what they call it as essential ecosystem areas to be managed and built as part of the management of wildlife as well as tigers and other large iconic species like Sumatran elephants as well as Sumatran rhinos. So, but still that poaching, on tigers as well as their prey still happening in the field. So we should put together our resources and efforts to improve our management on this tiger populations in those landscapes.
As mentioned earlier, Bill stressed that roads are the most prevalent infrastructure devised, and hearkening back to an earlier conversation I had with Phil Jacobson and Yaya Hidayati, it isn't always clear who exactly is providing the finances, hindering transparency and ultimately more rigorous regulation.
Yeah, well, roads are the most ubiquitous, probably the most ubiquitous thing that human beings do to the planet. I mean, I suppose you could say, well, climate change and this and that, but in terms of things that humans actually build and intentionally do, roads, which are just so ubiquitous, they're just found everywhere. They're expanding incredibly quickly. The ecosystems where we see them expanding incredibly quickly are the ones that are, in many cases, highly endangered ecosystems, like the global biodiversity hotspots and tropical ecosystems, tropical forests. And so, what we have is this avalanche of road building and other kinds of activities happening in these areas that are really the most pristine ecosystems on the planet. So it's we really very much have our work cut out for us, I think, in trying to have smarter development. And what's happening right now in so much of the world is that the development that's ongoing is chaotic and driven by corporations and others that are very keen to get in and rapidly exploit natural resources in a place.
Bill elaborated further on how China's Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI, is reaching into places such as Sumatra and is tied to various infrastructure projects on the island as well as across many other nations.
Well, in the last couple of years, we've put out papers on looking at infrastructure in Sumatra, of course, in Borneo, but dividing it up into Kalimantan and Sumatra and Sabah, and then also in New Guinea, in the Papua New Guinea and Indonesian New Guinea. And I think the one thing you'd have to say is, my gosh, it's incredible how fast the development is proceeding. And what we're seeing, for instance, is a lot of China-funded infrastructure projects where China's loaning money for development of major infrastructure, almost always with some eye towards intensifying local economic development. Yeah, I think we've got a lot of real challenges right now, and these are all part of a very aggressive global development scheme that China is sponsoring called the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is the biggest development scheme and also, in fact, the single biggest economic activity that has ever, if you can believe it or not, has ever occurred in human history. So the Belt and Road scheme right now, the last I saw, it will involve projects, or it could involve projects in 138 nations all around the world. And it's a multi-trillion-dollar scheme that's sponsored by China. And I think one would have to say, one could talk for an hour or two about this, but one could say that it's very much part of China's global strategy for increasing its economic and societal impact, has been to have this very large development scheme. Some people have a lot of concerns about it, for its environmental effects, for its potential impacts on small developing nations as they become increasingly indebted to China. But bottom line is, this is the biggest type of development activity, the biggest development scheme that we've ever seen, ever.
Bill believes that this Belt and Road Initiative is tied to some parts of the Trans-Sumatran Highway, and certainly tied to many infrastructure projects in Sumatra and Indonesia. But like mentioned earlier, transparency is difficult to achieve and often masks corruption.
I believe so. The different segments tend to be, one needs to break them down and look at them, and sometimes they'll have different people funding it. But my understanding is that there is a lot of, there are billions, tens of billions of dollars more of funding, which is involved Chinese funding in Indonesia. And it's all over Indonesia, including in Sumatra. And one thing that's important to bear in mind is that oftentimes China is not transparent And so trying to work out where the funding is and who's providing the funding and what different parties are involved and what their interests are, that is not an easy thing to do. Like it takes 5 seconds to ask the question, but the reality is it could take you 5 years to try to ferret out all the answers of what's going on. It's just there's a lot of stuff happening, and it's oftentimes happening in shadows and in areas where people can't really tell what's happening. And of course, this is also contributing to a serious problem of corruption.
Large infrastructure projects like the Trans-Sumatran Highway and the Batang Toru Hydro Dam are expensive affairs in and of themselves. And given the context of COVID-19, many of them have already run into delays and roadblocks, pushing back their deadlines or allegedly canceling them altogether. So I asked Bill if it was possible to see a similar situation with the Trans-Sumatran Highway. His answer was that even without climate change or COVID-19, big projects like this already have a high attrition rate due to the sheer scale.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think there will be some of that happening just because COVID has just changed so many things. I mean, there's no way that some of these big projects that were going along on all cylinders, moving along, and then suddenly they just stopped the project or, phased it way back or whatever. But the bottom line is when these things happen, or there can be attrition. And one of the things that we've really emphasized about big infrastructure projects is that they do suffer substantial attrition on their own. And by that, I mean, these are big, complicated projects. To get them to move ahead, you have to organize the financing, you have to organize all the permitting, the local approvals process, everything. So that's just natural. And of course, that varies a lot from country to country in terms of how robust that process is.
But even considering this, some projects may say they have stopped, but continue working behind the scenes. Bill used the recent report of a construction worker at the Batang Toru Dam project who was killed during seismic activity as an example.
I guess the question I would ask is, what's happening with the hydro dam project at Batang Toru? And is that project going to be shut down, or is it still proceeding? And it's kind of stopped without any explanation now, during the COVID thing. And there's been speculation that maybe they're going to stop it. But then recently, I don't know if you saw this, but recently there was a seismic event in the Batang Toru area, and a guy was killed, and he was actually on a tractor, like a grader or something. And there was an earthquake, and then his machine actually fell down into a gully or something, and it killed him. He was there working on that project, evidently, and no one knew. Again, this is what happens a lot of times. No one really knew what was going on there. No one knew that, in fact, there was activity happening. We thought it had been shut down. Well, now it turns out, it looks like there is more development activity happening there, which is bad news. A lot of these stories, they're not always straightforward. You know what I mean? Like you're trying to ferret out information, and even if you were working in the U.S., it probably wouldn't be entirely straightforward. You're trying to look at some developer and what's this developer doing, and you know what I mean? Who's he paying off or whatever? And there's lots of stuff happening here that, we kind of know what's going on, but it's not documented.
For his part, Beebach emphasizes that infrastructure projects like hydro dams, which roads supply, don't just impact remote forests that haven't been touched before, but also the water quality of the river ecosystems and the supply of the local inhabitants that live in these forests.
So building the hydropower plants will impact the quality of the water as well as the river ecosystems. The hydropower may also be installed in a lowland area, which is the most productive habitat not only for tigers but also for other wildlife species. I know that nowadays many hydropower plants installed underground infrastructure in order to reduce impact on the wildlife and natural forests, but still, at least during the installation, the workers need accesses to move heavy-duty equipment to install the infrastructure. And it can happen for, say, like 2 or 3 years until the plant is ready. And of course, the impact could go for another 2 or 3 additional years and even beyond. So again, if it's built in a remote forest area, then it will provide access for the people to get into the pristine forest along with their extractive activities.
Included in some of those extractive activities is, of course, mining, which can contaminate water that local inhabitants rely on with mercury.
Illegal mining in Sumatra is commonly happen in the upstream involving local people. They usually use mercury, if I'm not wrong, that's chemical stuff, to extract the mines with no sterilization procedure implemented. The chemical residual will flow and contaminate the entire river networks downstream, of course. So it would be very harmful not only for the health of the tigers and wildlife, but also the local inhabitants who depend on the rivers for their day-to-day lives.
Beebach also has insight into the threats faced by another large iconic species, the Javan leopard, which he says is in even more trouble than the Sumatran tiger, with less viable populations and less than 500 of them in existence. He says that whereas tigers are more likely to fight back when challenged, leopards are more prone to hiding, and there are only 3 national parks left that are capable of housing 50 or more leopards, making viable populations much more difficult to maintain. In short, they have less space to maintain long-term population growth.
I would say that it's even worse for the leopards. Both tiger and leopards are cryptic and elusive animals, except that the leopards are more opportunistic than the tiger in terms of prey base. They have a wider range of prey species, so they are more adaptable and resilient to disturbed area. As the Sumatran tiger, Javan leopard are classified as critically endangered by the World Conservation Union, but the Javan leopard number is even less viable than that of the Sumatran tigers, with fewer than, the most recent best estimate is less than 500 individuals. Like the tigers, they must share their homelands with humans in everyday life because more than 60% of their remaining habitats are outside of the protected areas. But unlike the tigers, however, leopards like to play hide and seek instead of fighting back when dealing with human. Now I think there are only 3 national parks capable of supporting as many as 50 leopard individuals. A minimum numbers of mature individuals, a large carnivore population should have in an isolated habitat to be viable for at least 50 years and ahead. So this include Gunung Halimun Salak National Park, Ujung Kulon National Park, and Merupakan National Park, and the rest. I think they are not viable.
Beebach emphasizes that the challenges the Javan leopard faces are quite similar to tigers: fragmented habitats, human conflict, poaching, and deforestation. But compared with the Javan leopard, tigers have the advantage of 27 isolated, albeit fragmented habitats, whereas the Javan leopard only has 22, comprising only 9% of the island of Java. To put this in perspective, Java is the most populated island on Earth, with over 140 million residents, and they share just 7% of the total land area of Indonesia itself with this leopard.
The threats that they face generally similar to tigers: small discontinued populations, small heavily isolated habitats, human-leopard interaction, hunting on leopards and poaching on prey. But they are now living in a 22 heavily isolated forest patches comprising less than, no more than 9% of the remaining of the total land area of Java Island. You know that Java is one of the most populated islands on Earth, as well as the other problem is that the mean patch size and core area index of Javan leopard habitats are the lowest among the remaining leopard habitats across their global range. So they have not enough space to live sustainably without effective conservation interaction. And last but not least, the most recent population viability analysis suggested that the remaining Javan leopard population have to be managed following metapopulation approach. All of the current subpopulation are projected in poor viability, means that no single remaining subpopulation can be survived in the long run without significantly reducing threats and frequent or periodic supplementation of adult individuals of both sex among the habitat patches.
And while the Sumatran tiger remains critically endangered, Beebach maintains that there is more support for Sumatran tigers than Javan leopards, and that the leopards are in need of more resources and efforts to maintain its population.
What needs to be done to improve the conservation of Javan leopards? I mean that for the Sumatran tigers, there are a lot of resources have been put in place so far, but I found that it's very challenging to get support from the for Javan leopard conservation so far. The remaining habitat is no more than 9% of the entire islands, as well as heavily isolated. Little chance to build corridors, for example. Most of the subpopulation is very low. That low small population has to be managed stronger, because the small population is tend to be very unstable in terms of due to threats from human activities. So I think it is important for the international communities as well. The government, of course, they have put some resources to protect the species in several landscapes through the scheme of the national park management, for example. But outside of the protected areas, there should be more effort and more resources to save the leopards, of course.
I want to thank Beebach for his contributions to this podcast and for his research on the Sumatran tiger and the Javan leopard. And I'd also like to thank Bill for his continued research on the impacts of infrastructure on the environment and for serving in his role on Mongabay's advisory board. Mongabay Explores is an ongoing podcast series diving into environmental stories from around the globe. Be sure to check out the previous episode in this series, which covers the proposal of the Batang Toru Dam and the impacts on wildlife such as the Tapanuli orangutan. Watch for a new edition of Mongabay Explores every 2 weeks, in between episodes of our flagship podcast, the Mongabay Newscast. Special projects like this are made possible by our Patreon supporters. Download our new app for Apple and Android devices to gain fingertip access to all our new shows and all of our previous episodes. We also ask that if you enjoyed this show, please tell a friend. That's the best way to help expand our reach and keep growing. As we enter the new year, Mongabay is asking you to invest in journalism that matters. Your support powers our reporting, which informs decisions supportive of a sustainable future and provides training for over 750 global journalists. Please support Mongabay at mongabay.org/donate. Keep up with all of Mongabay's news from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or get updates via Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, where our handle is @Mongabay. Thank you once again, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Mongabay Explores.